Hello and welcome to this episode of Trash to Track. In this episode I'm going to be looking at this Lima O gauge 4F locomotive that's been given to me for a service by my friend Lorna. Now I've never looked at these Lima O gauge models before, and first impressions are actually really good. This is a very nice looking representation of a 4F. I mean, it might not be 100% accurate, but it's a very good looking model, and the size of it ensures it's got a presence on the layout. I mean, just look at it on my workbench, it is absolutely huge. So I think somebody in the past has done some work on this model. It's got 3-link couplings on the front. It hasn't got sprung buffers, but it's got 3-link couplings, and putting some power onto it, it's not actually showing to be a runner. So I've got some controller leads, nothing's happening. So there's obviously something amiss with the motor. So I'm going to have to open this up and have a look at what's going on. So I'm going to put the tender aside for a second. And having a look underneath, logically I would have to remove the screw under the smoke box and the one underneath the cab. Now, as I said, I've never worked on a Lima O gauge model before. I've seen them at exhibitions and such, but I've never really paid much attention to them. And when I take the body off, yeah, I just realised there that this screw has to come off as well. This also holds the tender drawbar in place. But I am surprised that when I take the body shell off this model, that the motor inside is the same pancake Lima motor that is in their double O gauge stuff. Now I was expecting a much bigger motor or a much more powerful motor, but that is the same ring-field motor that you get in double O gauge Lima stuff. So I put a battery across the terminals, and it is trying to run. I think that battery might be flat now. When I put the other battery on, it does start running. So it is trying to run, although inside this is very dusty, and you'll find out why shortly. It's because somebody's filled it with foam for sound deadening, and the foam in the firebox, the foam is corroding away and gone all powdery. So I'm going to have to sort that out. And I think some of that powder has gone into the motor. So having a look at it, it looks very simple operation. The front pickups on the front four wheels only. The pickup piece unclips, and the motor is only held in place with plastic clips as well. So I should be able to remove the pickups on this and the motor as one unit and service the whole lot, which would be handy because the chassis is quite large. So there's the pickups for the front four wheels, and as I said, this motor is held in place with some plastic clips. So just prising the chassis open allows the motor and pickup assembly to be removed. He says, there you go, it's come off now, and there's actually two weights in there. Now the chassis itself is very free running, so it's going to be a case of servicing this motor and clean it all up. Now you can see that dust on there from that old manky foam. That all needs to come off there, and if it's got into the motor, I'm not surprised that it's not running too well. The pickups will all be polished up to be clean, and I will take the motor apart and have a look and clean the armature and commutator. So just prising the brush retainers up, I just lift the springs out and get the brushes as well. And when I get the brushes out of the model, that spring tried to make an escape for it, but I got it. The brushes are in very good condition. They are almost unused. There's hardly any wear on them at all. So removing the two screws will allow me to remove the motor faceplate. And there is the commutator faceplate there. And I'm going to clean this up with my normal method of cotton bud and meths initially to try and remove some of that black gunk, which is part of that corroded foam stuff mixed with the graphite, mixed with grease, I think. So in the end, I have to resort to polishing this up with a fiberglass pencil, giving it back its brass shine and just working gently so as not to scratch it, and then finishing it up with a cotton bud and meths again to remove any detritus, and there is still dirt coming off it. And I'm also cleaning these gaps out, as these had been bridged, some of them, with that manky old foam type stuff. I'm just going to wipe around the magnet there, and there is quite a lot of dirt on that. Now, it seemed in that there that the fiberglass pencil had actually scratched that commutator surface, but the camera is cruel and it magnifies it more than it actually is in real life. But that's the motor serviced. So I'm going to start putting it back together. A small amount of oil is dropped in there because there is a small bearing where the motor spins round, and the motor faceplate that I just cleaned is put back in place, and the 2 screws are replaced to hold that back in place. Once they're in, the brushes are put in, and like I say, these brushes are virtually brand new. There's hardly any wear on them at all. And then when the brushes are put back in, the spring is put in place and the retainer is pushed back down to hold it where it should be. So now this motor should fire up and run lovely. But what I'm going to do before I try it, I'm going to polish these pickups up. Now, using the dead battery as a bit of a trestle, I'm just going to polish these brass parts up with the fiberglass pencil, and you can see there that they are gleaming. And then again, cotton bit of mess to remove any stray fibres. Now I'm going to turn my attention to the chassis, which is very dusty. Those gears have got a lot of dust in them. The wheel spokes have got a lot of dust and crap all in them, so I'll give it a good dusting over, even on the underside, and weights are falling out. So it's obviously not been used much, this model, any time lately, because Lorna told me that they bought it from a toy fair and it's obvious that it's not been used in quite some time. So now, well, you can see all the rubbish that's come off this model on the paper there. Look at all that. But once that's all swept away, the chassis is now free of any dust, cobwebs, and anything else that was all over it. And I'm going to replace the weights. And then I'm going to add a small amount of grease onto the drivetrain, because there was no lubrication or any remnants of lubrication on this model, in all fairness. So I run that back and forward just to spread the grease through those gears and the drivetrain a little bit. And there's also a giant gear on that wheel, so I put a little bit on there as well. I'm also going to add a small amount of oil to the axles, as the metal axles sit in the plastic chassis. And although it is very free rolling, a little bit of oil will just help lubricate the chassis a little bit more, so that it is as free running as possible when we go to test this on the track later on. So a small amount of oil on all the well, they're not bearings, but all the holes where the axles go through. And now the chassis is lovely and free running. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to refit the motor, and as like before, you just line up the pins, the plastic pins, into the holes in the chassis, ensuring that that worm gear is engaged with the drivetrain correctly. So this took a little bit of doing because I couldn't get it lined up right, but there we go. That's in, the motor's clipped in place, and then the pickups. Now, I put these on the wrong way round. I should have made a note, but I put them on backwards, and when I tested the model, it went the wrong way. So because it's a simple unclip and turn around, it was a very easy thing to rectify. So it is worth noting, if you ever in a position where you're taking one of these apart and servicing it, it is worth making a note of which side the pickups go on which. Just mark it with a pen or something. But now that's all back together, a battery across the terminals, and initially it didn't work, but when that commutator started turning, it was a lovely and free runner. So I've now got the chassis hooked up to a controller, and it's being held up by the batteries, and I'm just going to polish these wheels up because the wheels had a lot of oxidization on them. It looked like surface rust, if I'm honest. So I did do some work on these, clean the wheel backs, clean the wheel treads. The centre set of wheels is not connected to the side rods, and these were cleaned by hand afterwards, where I had to turn the wheels independently. But with the fiberglass pencil and a cotton bud of meths, the wheels that are connected with the side rods were given a good polish up. And this is when obviously I'd realised that those pickups were on the wrong way round. So it was just a simple case of unclipping it and turning it round, and now it will run forwards when it should run forwards instead of going backwards, which almost caught me out. So now I'm going to test there we go, those pickups are working as are those. So everything's now working as it should. The only other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run the fiberglass pencil along the side rods because, as I said, there's a lot of surface corrosion. So just running them along the side rods removes that and brings the side rods up almost to a shine, but at least the oxidization has been removed. I'd much prefer seeing it removed because it didn't look very nice having that rust on there. These were never rusty in real life. So it's important to get all that corrosion off. And now I'm just removing any loose fibres and that with the cotton bud and meth. So now that's done, I'll turn my attention to the body shell. And as I said earlier, somebody has filled this with sponge, I assume to be a sound deadening thing. Now that orange sponge is okay, that's still alright, that's not corroding at all. But this other stuff here, look, it's just like powder. As sponge goes, or foam goes after a while, I've seen this before, especially on that foam underlay that Hornby used to make. I've seen it on layouts and it just corrodes into this horrible, slimy like dust stuff. So it's important to get that all out of there, otherwise it will just end up back in the motor. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this, I'm going to give this a clean up with a toothbrush and some hot soapy water, and then we'll come back. Turning my attention to the tender, this also needs a clean up, and the wheels on the tender, because they don't pick up any power, these just unclip. Now I notice the centre axle boxes are open. I don't know if there's axle box covers missing off this model or whether that's supposed to be like that. But I did also notice that the centre axle didn't have the pinpoint bearing, so maybe it's something to do with it being compensated to run on less than scale curves. So I'm going to give the tender body and the main body a wash, and here we are after I've given them a warm soapy water bath. Now it hasn't got all the muck and grime off, but it's got most of it off. What it's left behind actually looks really good. It looks like a workaday loco now, but I was slightly worried that the transfers were going to lift. So I've got a fresh piece of sponge and I'm going to put that in the firebox, and that original piece of orange sponge from the top I've wrapped in insulation tape. Now that will help with the noise deadening, and that new modern sponge there is not prone to the corrosion like the old stuff is. So then the chassis is reunited with the body, and the two screws that we took out earlier on are simply replaced, and that is the loco part of the 4F, all rebuilt and hopefully ready for service. You can see on this front screw that big black washer thing, that would have been the original coupling, I'd imagine, which has been taken off when somebody has fitted this with these 3 links. Now one thing missing that was loose in the box was a set of cab footsteps. Now these had been glued before because there was remnants of epoxy resin. So using that and the brass strengthener somebody else had put on, I apply a small amount of Loctite super glue, push that back into place and hold it until it has set firm. In hindsight, I probably used a bit too much super glue on that because a little bit did squeegee out, so I'm going to get rid of that with the end of a cocktail stick just to remove that off that footstep. And then I'm going to set that aside and let that dry. I'm just pushing it into place correctly there with that screwdriver. So now that dries, I'm going to look at the tender, because when I gave this a wash, this strip came loose. Now I don't know if this was added on after or whether it's a Lima part, but again a small amount of this Loctite, just very small amount along there, and spread it all the way along. We'll hold that back in place. Now I wouldn't recommend doing this with other brands of super glue. I have found that this Loctite stuff does not leave the white bloom that other super glues do. Maybe Plastic World Cement would have been a better option, but I use that Loctite as I've used it before, and it's done okay. Now the actual hook on the back of the tender, the hook and chain are separate. They've obviously been homemade, but the transfers have stood up well. That real coal load has come up nice, but the tender wheels again are showing signs of oxidization. So I'm going to give these a clean with the fiberglass pencil as well, because it all needs to really be clean when it's running on the layout. And like I said before, it is just dirt and surface rust on these. So these were cleaned with the fiberglass pencil, and then once that was done, again as my normal method, cotton bud and mesh to remove any of the fibres that are left over. And then once they're all done, these are given a dusting as well because the spokes have got quite a bit of dust in them. The wheels are then replaced into the tender. You can see there the shine I've managed to get on that wheel in comparison to the uncleaned one. And like earlier, the wheels are simply just a clip fit pinpoint axles on the outer most wheels, and that centre wheel has got a longer axle, no axle box covers. And I'd imagine, as I said, I think that's for negotiating tight curves. It allows the axle to be a bit more compensated than it would have otherwise have been. I notice that wheel there is loose on that axle, so I hope that doesn't cause any problems in the future. It shouldn't do. It shouldn't move now it's back in the tender. It should be okay. But that's the tender sorted out. So this 4F now is ready to be tested. Now, the only other thing I did put a tiny amount of oil into the axle boxes where the pinpoint axles go. I wouldn't do this on a 00 model, but because this is O gauge and the tolerances are a bit better, it's worth just lubricating them ever so slightly. Now, I really like this model. Like I said, I've never really had anything to do with Lima O gauge stuff, but this 4F is a really nice looking model. I mean, it might not have the finesse sprung buffers of modern O gauge stuff, but as a basic starter engine in O gauge, this really is a fantastic thing to look at. And I might have to try and trace an O gauge 33 that Lima made and do a direct comparison and see how they are. So as it's O gauge, again it's over to the Trains for You test O gauge bit of track because I have no O gauge at home. And the 4F, for its age and the fact that it's Lima, is an absolutely lovely, quiet runner. If you've got anything you'd like to see featured on Trash to Track, please email me at dansmodelrailways@gmail.com. I'm looking at getting it sent over, and who knows, it may even feature in an episode all of its own. Thank you so much for watching Trash to Track again. I'll leave you now with the 4F doing some shuttles on the Trains for You test track, and I will catch you all again in the next video. Bye for now. Oh, go in.